Have you ever been progressing with a given movement pattern, such as the deadlift, regardless if you're doing a Romanian deadlift, or maybe you're doing a stiff-legged deadlift, or even a good old conventional deadlift? At some point or another, you have to lift a lot lighter because if you continue to lift heavier, for whatever reason, you start to feel it in your lower back and not in a good way. I have been there many times before, which means I know that you've been there as well too. It can be very frustrating because of course, this limits your ability to continue to lift heavier and make the adequate amount of progress that you're looking for. Today, let's go over a specific strategy that's going to allow you to continue to see this progress that you're looking for without having to lift any heavier. Now, first and foremost, it is extremely important to ensure that you are bracing correctly. So when you are doing any type of lift, obviously we're talking about a hip hinging movement today, it's extremely important to ensure that you're bracing your abdominal wall. So since we are on the topic of deadlifts, let's talk about how you can do this properly before we talk about this additional strategy. So when we are hinging forward, we are putting ourselves in a lengthened position. So when we go to do that, we want to be focusing on breathing in. Now, a lot of people, when they breathe in, they are very heavy chest breathers. They'll breathe high into their chest. That is not what we want to do. We want to actively be focusing on breathing into our abdominal wall, into our diaphragm, not just in the front, but also on the sides as well too. A good cue for this is to pretend like you are taking a punch. Like if you feel like you can't take a punch, you aren't bracing correctly. So that's typically going to be a really good cue for a lot of people. So for anybody who's done yoga before, right? You've had your yoga instructor tell you to breathe into a specific area. It's very psychological, but even just actively trying to trigger the area that you want to focus on when you're breathing in, so that way you're not just doing heavy chest breathing, because then you're not bracing correctly, and of course you're experiencing lower back pain. You do want to make sure that this is your top priority and something that you master before anything else. So again, when we are putting ourselves into a lengthened position, we're at the top of the movement, we're gonna breathe into our sides, into our diaphragm, and not just up into our chest. Your chest shouldn't be moving whatsoever. So we're gonna breathe in, really, really tight, like you can take a punch. And when you come to your end range, hold that breath and start to come up to the starting position. And then when you're about halfway up, that's when you wanna focus on breathing out. A lot of people make the mistake of initiating the breath out when they're at this range right here. You know, you wanna try to start breathing out when you are about halfway up, so that way your core stays nice and tight. And then you can kind of relax a little bit when you are at the top, while still ensuring that you are tight enough where you feel like you can take a punch. After you have mastered the proper breathing technique, for whatever reason, a lot of us, myself included, we start to feel unwanted tension in our lower back when the weight is just getting too heavy. So what can we do to ensure that we are still making an adequate amount of progress without having to lift any heavier and to avoid our back being compromised? I like using a band. Doing some banded RDLs is a very great way to make the movement pattern much more challenging. So that way you can focus on still achieving progressive overload. So what we are gonna do here is we are gonna anchor the band in line with our hips. So you wanna find a place where you can do so. So typically I'll wrap the band. This is what I do at home. You can do this at the squat rack, at a local gym, wherever you train, and make sure that the band is parallel to the ground and it's in line with my hip. You don't want it going down like that. You don't want it going up like that. So make sure that you are adjusting the band again in line with your hip, and that's your starting position. So once we have our band anchored, I'm just using dumbbells today because it's a little bit easier, but you can set up a barbell in front of you. Make sure that the barbell is in the middle of the band, so that way when you go to pick it up, it's in the proper position. But we're gonna get into our band, and I'm gonna step forward so I know where I need to go, okay? So this is where I'm gonna be locked out at. So you wanna make sure you find your starting foot position at a place where your back isn't gonna be arched or anything like that. You might be leaning forward a little bit here. That's pretty normal because obviously the band is trying to pull me back. But make sure you're not going too far forward where you're arching like this at the top. We wanna still try to maintain a neutral spine, even if you're leaning forward ever so slightly. So our feet, of course, are gonna be in a normal position as you would when you are initiating any type of deadlift variation. You can use this for stiff-legged deadlifts, conventional deadlifts, or Romanian deadlifts. Today, we're gonna stick to the Romanian deadlift. So you can see that the dumbbells are right where I want them to be. So I'm gonna hinge over, get myself into a good starting position here. I'm gonna grab the dumbbells. So obviously there's no tension on the band right here. So that makes it a little bit easier at the start of the position. But when we extend up, that's where you're gonna notice a lot of that increased level of tension that we are looking for here. So I'll demonstrate and then we'll break it down. So as you can see, when I'm squeezing at the top, that's where the movement pattern becomes more challenging because when I'm in this position, the band is wanting to pull me back. So I'm having to squeeze my glutes even harder in order to achieve full hip extension. Make sure you're not arching your back, keeping that neutral spine, but full hip extension, really squeezing my glutes, coming back down, and then focusing again, full hip extension, and squeezing at the top. So we're gonna come down. Voila. So I think it's pretty obvious, right, as to why this specific variation makes it much more challenging with increasing the level of difficulty of a deadlift without having to add more weight on the bar. It increases tension at the easiest portion of the movement, which is your hip extension. Let's just kind of break down the science of it a little bit here as to why this makes it much more challenging. And this is because it allows you to maximize what is known as torque. And I know that that's maybe a little bit above what we're trying to accomplish with this YouTube channel. I'm not trying to get super detailed into scientific terms, but just so people have a basic understanding, torque is a combination of load and moment arms. You know, your body doesn't just recognize how much weight is on the bar. It also recognizes the distance away from the active joint that we're trying to target. So in this case, we're trying to grow our glutes, where the main movement comes at your hip extension. Maximizing loading your glutes at hip extension is what's going to allow you to grow your glutes. So by adding the band, obviously this makes the movement of the hip extension much more challenging. So that's why I say your body doesn't just recognize how much weight you are lifting. Another good example is when you're doing lateral raises, right? You're doing like lateral raises down here and you're holding the same weight that you would be doing lateral raises up here. Obviously, it's gonna be way more challenging doing the movement this far away, right? That just comes down to increasing torque. So this is very much the same concept here when we are adding a band for deadlift variations. So again, torque is a combination of load and moment arms, which is just basically the lengths of your limbs. You can't change the lengths of your limbs to make a movement pattern more difficult, right? But you can change the load by adding a band. And this is what makes it more challenging when the bar or the dumbbells get closer to that trained joint, which again is our hips. Whereas without a band, as the bar or the dumbbells come closer to that trained joint, the torque in theory is going to decrease. So overall, less torque means less challenging. With a band, as the bar path comes closer to your hips, it becomes more challenging. Therefore, torque of these trained joints increases. So adding a band during deadlift variations, especially when you're struggling to add more weight on the bar, can be a very strategic way to just maximize hip extension. So it's worth giving a try. There is nothing wrong if you can continue adding weight on the bar, but if for whatever reason you are noticing a diminishing return where other areas in your body are giving you clear signs that it is not happy, you're pissing it off, there's some wear and tear, and there's that diminishing return where you are limiting yourself and unable to achieve progressive overload on a given movement pattern, adding a band can be a great way for you to continue to make that progress that you're looking for.